Telephone conversation, Volsoinka. The price seemed reasonable, location indifferent. The landlady swore she lived off premises. Nothing remained but self confession. Madam, I warned, I hate a wasted journey. I'm African. Silence. Silenced transmission of pressurized good breeding. Voice, when it came, lipstick coated, long gold rolled cigarette holder piped. Caught I was, foully.
How dark?
I had not misheard.
Are you light or very dark?
Button B, button A. Stench of rancid breath of public hide and speak. Red booth, red pillar box, red double tired omnibus squelching tar. It was real. Shamed by ill mannered silence. Surrender pushed, dumbfounded, to beg simplification. Considerate she was, varying the emphasis.
Are you dark or very light?
A revelation came. You mean like plain or milk chocolate? Her accent was clinical, crushing in its light impersonality. Rapidly, wavelength adjusted, I chose West African sepia, and as an afterthought, down in my passport. Silence for spectroscopic flight of fancy, till truthfulness clanged her accent hard on the mouthpiece.
What's that?
Conceding,
Don't know what that is.
like brunette.
That's dark, isn't it?
Not altogether. Facially I'm brunette, but madam, you should see the rest of me. Palm of my hand, soles of my feet are a peroxide blonde. Friction, caused foolishly, madam, by sitting down, has turned my bottom raven black. One moment, madam. Sensing her receiver rearing on the thunderclap about my ears. Madam, I pleaded, wouldn't you rather see for yourself?
Hello viewers, today let's talk about a very interesting and thought-provoking poem, Telephone Conversation by Volsoinka. Telephone Conversation is all about racism. Racism that talks about domination or superiority of one class over the others. Let's get to know a little about the poet Volsoinka. Volsoinka was born on 13 July 1934 in Abeokuta in western Nigeria. After completing his university studies, he attained his doctorate degree in 1974. He produced his own plays and also acted in them. Few of his theatre companies include the 1960 Mass and the Horizon Theatre Group. He has around 20 of his works published, that includes novels, drama and poetry. It is interesting to note that most of Soyinka's works reflect the traditional African drama that has a combination of music, dance and action. Soyinka was highly influenced by the Irish writer J.M. Synge. We can see that most of his writing is based on the mythology of his own tribal group, the Yoruba. A few of his works include The Trial of Brother Jero, Jero's Metamorphosis, A Shuttle in the Crypt, Idandre and Other Poems, etc. We can see that Soyinka's works mirror the political and social ills that have befallen his nation. Soyinka attained the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1986. Now, few of his works like A Shuttle in the Crypt, The Man Died and Season of Anemone talk about the gruesome incidents of war in Nigeria. And it also shows a manifestation of how Soyinka grew as a thinker and writer. Now, before getting into the poem, let me ask you a few questions. How would it be if someone denies you an entry into a local transport because of your color? Or how would you feel if you were deprived of education because you belong to a particular group that someone does not approve of? Can you talk about a few examples that talk about racism? Well, you must be remembering our great leader Mahatma Gandhi was thrown out of a train while he was traveling to South Africa because of his color. Now, another example that we can quote off is the American and one of the pioneers of the Black emancipation movement, Martin Luther King Jr., along with his fellow mates, was deprived of citizenship rights most of his life. Yes, can you talk about any other example?
About transportation, there's the example of Rosa Parks and how that starts, well, that spurs of another civil rights movement in America. A subtler form of racism is what happens in, To Serve With Love.
Wonderful.
Where technically he's allowed all the rights any other British citizen has, but of course he is being discriminated against because he's black.
All these and many more instances are but examples that talk about racism. Racism that's still being practiced in major parts of the world today, like America, Africa, and then Australia. I'm sure you all are aware of it. Now this poem, Telephone Conversation, talks about racism. It is a conversation between two people, the white English landlady and the black prospective tenant. It's highly enraging when we come across when people are being discriminated based on color, caste or group. Soyinka's experiences as a darker brother put him under constant trials, and hence his works have a reflection of racism. Well, by the end of the poem, you might understand how universal this notion of racism is. But one cannot forget that the emotions of love and brotherhood supersedes every other feeling, and that is the very essence of life. Well, Soyinka's doctrine, we will not rest until mankind is restored to its natural. It's followed by most of his followers too. Now let's discuss the first few lines of the poem. The price seemed reasonable, location indifferent. The landlady swore she lived off premises. Nothing remained but self-confession. Madam, I hate a wasted journey. I'm African. When we look at the title of the poem Telephone Conversation, it has a deeper meaning. It talks about a conversation between two people. Here it is a conversation between two diverse ideologies, two diverse cultures, the white English woman and the black prospective tenant. When we also look at the play in the title, the play of words in the title, it shows that figuratively and literally both the speakers are miles apart, but then they open to the world this agenda of racism. The poem begins with the tenant trying to seek an apartment which happens to be indifferent, but still the tenant moves on to hire the apartment that talks about his urgency or the need to hire one. As the price of the apartment seems to be reasonable, and also since the landlady lived off premises, the tenant decides to talk to the landlady and make a self-confession. We all make mistakes in life, big or small, and that leads us to confess. We want to confess when we are sorry about our doings and want to be apologetic either to ourselves or to the people on whom we have sinned. In fact, the author's usage of the word self-confession talks about the apprehension or the fear that's lingering in the mind of the prospective tenant about not being able to hire the apartment because of his race. It also gives the reader a notion or as though the tenant has committed a sin. And since the tenant hates a wasted journey, he admits that he is an African.
There are always other examples, particularly when we note the very powerful diction that this poem has. For instance, there's the movie The Great Debaters, where the pivot of the film is the tiny black college debating group which finally overtakes Harvard and makes a very important statement in terms of lynching blacks.
Yes.
And then you have the popular examples like Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, where he's constantly being referred to as this black man,
Yes.
or Othello, for
Yes.
instance, where the alienation is being done on the grounds of his being so black
Yeah.
and out. Again, when we look at the very alienation working in the diction, we have more popular examples, more recent examples, like, say, Mr. and Mrs. Iyer,
Iyer.
where Rahul Bose, or Raja Chaudhary,
Yeah.
his character, mostly draws the line between how, because he gets a new name, suddenly his religion has a major
Different
change, his identity has
yeah.
such a major change in itself.
Silence, silence transmission of pressurized breathing. Voice when it came, lipstick coated, long gold rolled, cigarette holder piped. Caught I was foully. How dark? I had not misheard. Are you light or very dark? After having heard the tenant's origin, the lady on the other side is silence. Can you guess what the silence means? She's shocked. In fact, it talks about her unwillingness to let out the apartment to a black. Okay. In fact, the author also uses the phrase silence transmission of pressurized breathing. In fact, the tenant thinks that it is a sign of good breeding. But then when he uses the terms lipstick coated, long gold rolled, cigarette holder piped, it says that landlady's social status is suddenly being revised or upgraded, a contradiction to the earlier thought. In fact, here we can see that the author uses sarcasm rather. The objects are but symbols that contribute in the making of a typical English woman to conform to the norms of the English society, a well-bred English woman. Caught I was foully. He uses this phrase when the landlady is silent after listening to the tenant's origin. It conveys the difficult situation that he is confronted with, and hence he uses this phrase, caught I was foully. And later the woman tries to ask him, how dark? Are you light or very dark? The diction here is in bold and also capitalized. Now here we can see the blatant manifestation of racism. Button B, button A, stench of rancid, breath of public hide and speak. Red booth, red pillar box, red double-tired omnibus squelching tar. It was real. Shamed by ill-mannered silence, surrender pushed dumbfounded to beg simplification. Considerate she was, wearing the emphasis. Are you dark or very light? Revelation came. You mean like plain or milk chocolate? Her accent was clinical, crushing in its light impersonality. The question of the landlady, in fact, stupefies the tenant, but then his anguish is not overtly expressed. We can understand how the author tries to draw the attention of the readers towards the various objects in and around the telephone booth. Button B, button A, red booth, red pillar box, red double-tired omnibus. Here we can talk about the psychological displacement that's happening or that the tenant is experiencing here. He's been cornered or he's been put to shame. But then these objects might also mean that the questions asked by the English lady are not illusionary, but a reality that he's confronted with. And then the tenant's anger can be felt by the usage of the color red, and it's being used repetitively. Red has different connotations for positive and negative as well, but here it's used for, a metaphorical representation of the tenant's anger, right? And then we can also say that, it arouses humor, in fact, here when the tenant tries to seek further clarification from the English lady, when he tries to bring out the actual intention of the English lady when he compares his color to plain or milk chocolate. Okay, and then she again goes on to question him, are you light or very dark? And then her actual intention is to, to get a plain answer, white or black. When the landlady questions about the tenant's color, the author's reference to the various objects around talks about the psychological displacement felt by the tenant. We can also refer to a situation when someone gets onto the stage and becomes very conscious about the audience and then tries to adjust the dress or tries to fondle with some article. It is a similar uneasiness felt by the tenant, and hence reference to the objects like button B, button A, red booth, red pillar box, etc. We can see that the author uses the phrase revelation came. Here the speaker is able to understand that the landlady is expecting a simple white or black answer from the tenant. Okay, in the later lines, the author uses the words, her accent was clinical. Now, why do you think the poet has used these lines?
An implication of some sort of a detachment.
Wonderful, yes. It shows that she is a highly unemotional woman, highly detached, and very precise in her thoughts and very precise in her beliefs. While she is the face that represents the white community, and the tenant, the black tenant, is highly empathetic, who is able to sense the feelings of the white English woman, and he is the face that represents the black community. Impersonality, rapidly wavelength adjusted, I chose West African sepia, and as afterthought, down in my passport, silence for spectroscopic flight of fancy, till truthfulness changed her accent, hard on the mouthpiece. What's that? Conceding don't know what that is? Like brunette, that's dark, isn't it? Not altogether, facially I'm brunette, but madam, you should see the rest of me. Palm of my hands, soles of my feet are a peroxide blonde. Friction caused foolishly, madam, by sitting down has turned my bottom raven black. One moment, madam. Sensing her receiver rearing on the thunderclap about my ears, madam, I pleaded, won't you rather see it yourself? Now we can say that the poem is highly dramatic in the sense that the author and the tenant is able to sense the feelings and the thoughts that is there in the mind of the white English woman. Okay, here the tenant, when he reveals that he is a West African sepia, an authenticated identity that he carries also in his passport, she is silent for some time. Okay, the landlady tries to shower further questions on the tenant, and then, highly infuriated by the volley of questions showered on the tenant, he goes on to describe the colors of various parts of his body. He says facially his brunette, and the palms of his hand and the soles of his feet are peroxide blonde, and then the bottom has gone raven black because of friction. And when he moves on to say further, he suddenly hears a thunderclap on the other side. The thunderclap indicates that the landlady is highly incensed by the tenant's intelligent confrontation. In fact, she might have had a misconception that the tenant would quietly accept her denial. She might be thinking that he is a savage and won't be able to answer her back. But then we can understand from the language used by the tenant that he uses no harsh words. In fact, he gives a very subtle and witty answers to the landlady. Silence for spectroscopic flight of fancy, till truthfulness clanged her accent, hard on the mouthpiece. We can see the alternating sounds of words, that is soft versus hard, used by the author when the tenant says that he is West African sepia. The tenant's talk here is soft while the lady is very precise and unempathetic, asking further, "What's that?" It is not unusual for the black community to have such experiences in their life, but what needs to be thought is discrimination of any kind is intolerable. Soyinka, as a darker brother, has had similar experiences, and in his works he puts across this problem of apartheid or exclusion in a very subtle manner. It gives a clarion call to all the people across the globe that discrimination of any kind cannot be tolerated nor practiced. In fact, it evokes further for the leaders on the international stage to consider racism in their primal agenda. In fact, the poem gives a clarion call to all the people across the globe to neither practice nor tolerate discrimination of any kind. Soyinka puts across a situation in all its horror and sensitiveness and evokes the outrage that it deserves.
Ma'am, this is a very subtly put sensitive issue, definitely, but isn't it also a case of strong black reclamation of identity of some sort? Because she is expecting a black savage. That's the root cause behind the denial. And what she gets is what she might perceive to be suavely obscene, because I guess that's how the reaction is. So here, by being suave to meet her, but at the same time implicating that in those very bold, dark words, isn't he in some way...
And the different objects mentioned there.
Completely. Isn't he in some way reclaiming his identity? He is being the double-edged sword, at the same time like being suave and sophisticated, the kind of sophistry she mightn't expect from a savage, but at the same time reclaiming a bit of his identity in terms of his diction or expressions that he uses.
Definitely he has to put across his stand as a human being. That's, I think, the very essence of, using those very soft words. His anger is hidden behind those words, the diction especially that's being used here. Won't you rather see for yourself? These lines we can see in the last part of the poem, as the landlady is highly annoyed by the tenant's intelligent confrontation, and in spite of she hanging the phone, the tenant asks the empty telephone line, "Won't you rather see for yourself?" requesting the lady to meet him in person to judge his color herself. Here we can understand that the tenant is not only confronting for being victimized, but also ascertaining that he is a human being and deserves to be respected. Soyinka uses several techniques to depict racism. Here we can talk about repetition, capitalization, and the usage of satire. Repetition, when we look at the phrases in the poem, "Are you light or very dark?" is being repetitively used, and also the repetition of color red, as in red booth, red pillar box, red double-tired omnibus, squelching tar. All these are used to drive home a particular point in the mind of the readers. When we can talk about a few more poems where the poets are very fond of using repetition. For example, when we can talk about Tagore's very popular poem, Song 36 from Gitanjali, he uses the phrase, "Give me strength." Give me the strength, in fact. He uses it in almost all his lines to intensify his prayer to God. Okay. And then the usage of color red. The usage of color red, as in red booth, red pillar box, red double-tired omnibus, it talks about the anger that the tenant is experiencing here, and that's what is the poet trying to put across to the readers. The poet uses capitalization as a technique to talk about the intensity of those words, or to talk about the folly of human judgment based on color. Are you dark or very light is being capitalized. It is the English woman's version that's being capitalized, and then the poet is dramatic in its sense that we are able to understand or able to, empathize with her intention on racism. Soyinka also uses satire to express racism using words contradictory in which it occurs. Satire is often used in many artistic forms like language, drama, and commentary and media as well. Now, where do you find satire here in the poem?
When he describes his color and his
yes.
body parts,
Yes.
peroxide blonde, raven black,
Yes.
that's all his witty remarks,
Yes.
as answers.
Yes. He's been witty, he is not overtly expressing his anger here. In fact, he uses very, very, very subtle and delicate words to express his anguish.
It's also the fact that she's objectifying him by asking him what color he is, and he's carrying her objectification to its logical conclusion by
Yes.
separating himself into fragments and of
Yes.
various colors.
Yes.
Then he's describing himself in hair colors,
Yeah.
in artificial hair colors that come out of bottles.
Peroxide blonde especially.
Peroxide blonde, raven black, this
Yeah.
is not something that you used to talk about
Natural, yeah.
the color of a person,
True.
but the color of something artificial.
And then initially when he talks about the English woman, we have the notion, in spite of the hollowness of a notion on, racism, his imagination of the English woman seems to be suddenly revised when he talks about lipstick coated and long gold rolled cigarette holder pipe. So here also the poet uses satire. And then one more situation that we can talk about is he makes a self-confession. Why does he have to make a confession there?
Because according to the British woman, being black is a crime. He just tells it in such a way that I'm confessing my color. I'm just telling her what I am in reality.
In fact, he is feeling sorry for something about which he cannot have control over.
Which he can't help it.
Yes, yes.